And what we're doing today, I talked to last night's class a little bit about the upcoming schedule changes. So what we'll be doing today is part two of the Torah portion. There was no way to cover the four winds um, in one session, and there's really going to be no way to cover the four winds in two sessions. It sounds like more like something that needs to go into a book because it's like building blocks. As you see the relationship between the four angels, the four winds, the four divisions of the tribes of Israel, eventually you would move into something like the four horses of Revelation to see how they correspond, to see how they're also seen as horns. And so if you're interested in prophecy and you like, reading the book of Daniel and Revelation and all that mystical language, learning about these four winds gives you another building block in terms of kind of shoring up what you know about horns. When you would see like four horns or one horn or something coming out of another horn, there's another layer there. You don't have to rely on the interpretation of one symbol. Typically, scripture is going to give you several ways to interpret those symbols, and each one will fill in some gap. It's just a matter of finding them, having the patience to find them. So like I say, in two sessions, we're not going to cover the four winds because they're too deeply embedded in prophecy. But it's like I said, if you want to talk to me about prophecy, the first thing you have to ask me is, which Torah portion are we talking about? Because to me, that's where it grows. If I can identify the Torah portion, then from there, I can make the leap into a particular book of prophecy. So studying the arrangement of the 12 tribes, that's that foundational thing that will help you begin to jump into some books of prophecy that are going to be founded right here, rooted and founded here. And so what that does is it keeps you kind of anchored to the specific Torah portion, which is the original prophecy. And as long as you're tethered to those Torah portions, then it's not as risky in terms of getting off in weird interpretations and applications. And we have a long history of weird interpretations and applications. It's like every generation since Messiah has been convinced that he's going to come back on a particular day. And so far, there's been 0% success rate on weird applications and interpretations. So we, like we said last week, there's a reason he doesn't want us to know the day or the hour. He will give us everything we need to be prepared for that day and hour. We won't be caught unawares if we obey his word. But if we knew, we would be a mess. It would be like, we talked a while back about, what was it, The Hobbit or something, where there was a specific ring that as long as you had the ring, you had all this power. And that's prophecy it carries the risk of that. You can get so pulled into prophecy and so focused on prophecy that it becomes that ring that becomes all powerful, at least up until the predicted date that Messiah is going to come back and he doesn't show. So we want to avoid date setting for sure, but we can, exhaust ourselves as much as we want in terms of exploring the times and the seasons, because we shouldn't be ignorant of the times and the seasons. So the winds will be another application of this. Let me, oops, I forgot to screen share. Let me do that. And I've got a video to show you that I'm hoping works. If it doesn't work, you'll just have to use your imagination. Let's see. Okay, so this is where we started last night. And by the way, like I was telling last night's class, be sure you actually read the emails when I send them out, the links today, and then anything you might get on Sunday. for sure open and actually read, because the scheduling is going to be disrupted for the next 2 weeks. I'll be teaching at Shavuot next week, which is going to replace the Tuesday class. Everybody will be invited in because we're just going to move that teaching into the Shavuot service at our congregation and do the Song of Songs teaching there. Then we will have that Monday night class. But then the next week, there may not be any class, depending on the recording schedule at HRN. I might be able to invite the Tuesday class to sit in with me on a couple of recording sessions in workbook 2. But that's why you need to really pay attention to the schedule over the next couple of weeks, and then we should be able to cycle right back into our normal schedule. So we're going to do Bamidbar last night, today, and then next week we'll do the Shir HaShirim, because I feel like in doing the 4 winds, it will even extend into the Torah portion from next week, some of the concepts there. So we're in a new book of the Torah, Bamidbar, and it means in the wilderness. And so in the wilderness, Bamidbar, Adonai numbered and organized the Israelites by tribe in order to prepare them for the journey into the land of Israel. And so, again, because we're going to jump right into this cloud, protective cloud that's on the periphery of our Torah portions at this point, if we're kind of curious as, okay, what does happen when we're gathered into the cloud with Yeshua? What happens next? Well, our Torah portions can suggest what's going on. And the suggestion is that we not only go into that 10-day period of eating and drinking at the table with Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob. In other words, the whole body of Messiah is involved in that 10-day celebration until everything is sealed over at Yom Kippur. But it also suggests that there will be an organizational period, that sometime during that period, if we don't know exactly who we are and where we fit in and what's my role and where do you want me to go and where do I camp and, what's my work schedule, even though I don't know that we'd be able to classify it as work as we know it, because it'll actually be something we want to do. But it sounds like part of that period is an organizational period, because if following that, if we look at the Jubilee pattern, you're going to be released to go back to your inheritance. Well, you would need to know where to go. If you didn't already know, maybe you already know where you're going. I don't know. But if you don't know where you're going, if you don't know which tribal territory you'll be assigned to, if you don't know what kind of work you'll be doing for the kingdom at that point, I'm sure you will receive your assignments. I don't know if it comes in a manila folder, if it's just an automatic download, if it's an interview. I don't even know that, but at some point during that period in the clouds, you will find yourself being organized. Let's see, we'll skip that. We don't want to do this again. And there's just briefly a look at the camp so that you can see how the 4 clouds of glory, there were 7 clouds. This shows 4 of them that surrounded the sides of the camp. Of course, you've got the pillar of cloud that's going to lead, and then you're going to have a cloud above and a cloud below. And it's the cloud above, I believe, that Paul refers to the Corinthians. So let's advance here. And hopefully, if there's anything critical, if you didn't have a chance to listen to the recording from last night, if there's anything critical, hopefully I'm repeating enough that it'll make sense. And then you can go back later. Here's the tribal banners of the 12 tribes plus the banner of Levi. But this is really where I wanted to go last night. I wanted to look at the 4 divisions. And the 4 divisions are comprised of 3 tribes each. And so the arrangement was under their degalim, which we would interpret as a banner or a flag. But what we learned last night is it's not just a piece of cloth waving in the wind. It's much deeper than that. It has a deep spiritual significance because it represents the spiritual authority and the spiritual obligation of that particular division of tribes, because it's a reminder. Again, it goes back to those four angels that are in charge of the four winds, and the four angels that were believed to also have been assigned to these four divisions based on the four winds, or the directions in which they would have faced in their encampment. And because they're being organized as an army, the idea is every tent would have been facing in toward the Mishkan. But if you're being organized as an army, you would have to be equally concerned as to what's going on facing outward. Even though they've got the clouds of glory in a military mode, you would need to be concerned or have an orientation in both directions. So in one sense, they're facing inward. In another sense, they're facing outward toward the four winds, toward the four directions. And of course, each of these degalim had a particular symbol on it. In Judah's division, it was the lion. In Reuven's division, it was a man, or the appearance of a man. Whether it was the plant, the dudaim, or whether it was the root of the plant that looks like a man, the consensus is it had the appearance of a man. Ephraim is the bull, referring to his father Joseph. And then Dan would be the eagle, or perhaps they said an eagle that had the appearance of a flying serpent, because his tribal banner would have been a serpent. But again, there's an association with these four angels: Gabriel, Michael, Raphael, and Uriel. And the way that they camped would have been to complement one another in terms of strengths and weaknesses. So I wanted to show you something interesting before we get in here and try to make this video work. I couldn't get it to work on my computer, so I uploaded it to YouTube. And I thought, well, we'll just complicate things even more and see if it works. So, Bezrat Hashem, it'll work. This is a quote that I found from Rabbi Eliezer, and he is quoted quite a bit in the Song of Songs Midrash. But he's commenting on the four winds, and this is, again, I think a great summary when you think of the four winds, and I would take notes on this. If you don't already know this, some of you may. If you don't already know this, what they've done is they've analyzed how the winds work in Scripture from Genesis to Malachi, and kind of summarized the characteristics of each of these biblical winds. And this would be from the standpoint of Israel, not from Haiti or Canada or Beijing. This would be from the center of the world, from the viewpoint of Israel and the Bible. So he says there are four winds in the world: the east wind, the west wind, the south wind, the north wind. The east wind, he says, from there, the light goes out to the world. And another commentary, yes, this is where the light goes out, so it can be seen as a good thing, a positive thing. But the alternative to that is that east wind, where the light goes out, can also be the most damaging wind. Remember the locusts, the plagues are associated with the east wind. It can be a very hot, destructive wind. So for each of them, you might find something positive or negative, depending on the needs of your geography. Because if you get the wrong wind in the wrong geography, then it's not a blessing, it's a curse. He says there's the south wind, and this is, again, they say this particular wind is associated with the throne of mercy. We talked about the throne of judgment, the throne of mercy last week. Well, the south wind is seen as, in general, to be a positive thing. It says, from there, dew of blessing and rains of blessing go out to the world. These would be the good rains. These would be the dews. In terms of both of those, if they come at the right time, they are a blessing. If they come at the wrong time, they're a curse. And if you've ever prayed out of the Siddur, you know that there's a prayer in there where we either pray for dew or we pray for rain. And we don't pray for our own need. We pray on behalf of Israel. We defer to their seasons. And so from Pesach, I believe, to Sukkot, we're praying for dew, because rain at that time, or hard rains, would be damaging to all the crops. But from Sukkot until Pesach, you're going to pray for the rains, because you need those heavier rains in order to get the crops to grow. So that's why you have to pray, that you don't just randomly pray and say, oh, I'm in a hurry today, let me pray for dew instead of rain. No, you need to know the season so that the prayer comes at the right time, so that you're not praying for a curse to come on the land, because that's not the right time for that particular thing. For instance, if you need the dew, then you don't want heavy rain. If you need heavy rain, the last thing you want is just dew. He says there's the west wind. He says from there, darkness goes out to the world. The north wind. From there, the stores of snow and the stores of hail and cold and heat and rains go out to the world. So the north wind, the implication here is it's more severe, because it's not just, nice little showers of blessing. It's storehouses of snow. And I believe it's in Job or Proverbs where he says he's reserved the storehouses of snow against the day of judgment. So snow can be associated with judgment. You need a certain amount of snow in order to get your moisture in certain climates, but excessive snow destroys things, or snow out of time destroys things. I remember one year here we had snow in May. That was not the right time for snow. If you're trying to get your garden out and things, the last thing you want is a heavy frost or snow. So the north wind is associated with these extremes. The hail, which is destructive, which is damaging, the excessive cold, the excessive heat, the damaging rains, the flooding rains, those would be attributed to the north wind. And the reason I included this, because I could have just put the summary on there for you for each of the four winds, and I still think it's important for you to know those things. If you keep a diary of terms, like this might be important later, especially as we get in the book of Revelation and we see the four angels holding back the four winds. We can see that for at least temporarily, until the saints are being marked or set aside, so that they won't be overtaken by these four winds. Because see, what's about to happen is those four angels, once they take away their restraint from those four winds, they'll all start blowing at the exact same time. There would be no prevailing wind. And normally we have a prevailing wind. We have one that's stronger than the others, so that the world is not destroyed. But in this case, he's saying, okay, hold them all back until I've sealed the saints. And once those saints are sealed, once they come under my protection, then they're going to be able to release those four winds, and the world will descend into a state of chaos, both spiritually and probably meteorologically. I didn't think I could get all those syllables in at the same time, because one speaks of the other. But like I said, the reason I put this particular summary in there is I found an odd statement. about the north wind. And this particular statement, I don't know why he put that in there. I kept reading and I couldn't find anything that would have clued me in. Just why would he make a statement like this? Because as far as I'm concerned, this statement is only going to make sense to people like us who can see Yeshua in the Torah. But here's the statement he makes about the north wind. It says he created it, but he didn't complete it. He said that anyone who would say that he is God should come and complete this wind, which I left alone, and all will know that he is God. Right? In other words, somebody who can take control of the north wind, who can become its completion, is going to be associated with God himself. Right? So we're talking here about 4 winds that are each doing a different job. That's why you need a prevailing wind. You don't want 4 winds struggling together at the same time, because then it'll just destroy. There won't be any organization, just like the tribes had to be organized. They couldn't go forward in chaos. They couldn't camp in chaos, and they couldn't move in chaos. Same thing with the winds. You don't want them blowing chaotically. You want them blowing according to an organization of their mission and the season. And so in this, we see that north and south, yes, they're geographic polar opposites, but even their waters are going to be different, because each wind is going to carry clouds, right? And whether those clouds are going to contain damage or whether they're going to contain blessing, the lesson we found last night was that it's completely contingent upon the behavior of Israel and what it's doing on earth, so that these polar opposites don't conspire to bring destruction. So let's look back at the west for a second. Keep that thing about the north in your mind. And hang on just a second. Apparently we're going into a gasoline emergency. Okay. The north wind, we know that it has destructive elements, but there's also this odd association with the ancient rabbis that says it's incomplete. And the person who can take authority over that north wind, who can be its completion, is going to be associated with God himself. Now I'm going to take you to the west wind. I'm going to take you to the direction of the west. And Hosea 11:9-10, it says, I will not carry out my fierce anger. I will not destroy Ephraim again. Now, destruction. How does destruction come to Israel? Figuratively, through the 4 winds. These winds of destruction can take them in different directions. And just kind of as an aside, it's understood that the exile of the Jews particularly was seen as being in the north country, because this is primarily the place that they returned to the land of Israel in modern times. They primarily came from the lands of the north, even though you did have some come from the east, and they don't get as much press, obviously, as Ashkenazi Jews, but nevertheless, there's a good portion that came from the east, that came from the Arab countries. But this west wind addresses Ephraim. He says, I will not carry out my fierce anger. I will not destroy Ephraim again, for I am God and not a man, the Holy One in your midst, and I will not come in wrath. In other words, the damaging effect of the wind that carried them away is going to be neutralized. He says, I won't come in wrath. He says, Ephraim will walk after the Lord. And remember what we said walking was. It's studying in order to do. He says, Ephraim will walk after the Lord. He will roar like a lion. Indeed, he will roar. And his sons will come trembling from the west. Right? The implication is here is they were probably blown out by an east wind, because remember, Judah camped on the east, and that divisional degel was a lion. And remember, the east wind carries light, but it also carries, a plague. It's destructive. It's seen as the most destructive of the winds when it's angry. And so Ephraim was blown out to the west, but Hosea is prophesying of a time when those winds will be withheld, the damaging winds will be withheld, and Ephraim will be able to come back from the west. He will hear a lion roar, and the children of Ephraim will begin trembling. They will hear that roar of the lion, and they will start coming from the west. So you're wondering why I've got a map of the Galilee, Google Maps. I've got a pin dropped on the lake, the Sea of Galilee, and that is going to be Tiberias or Caesarea. And you can see that Caesarea is located on the west side of the Sea of Galilee. And this particular pin, I dropped it where the last Sukkot we were there at a hotel where we stayed, because some of the tourists were going to take a boat ride on the Sea of Galilee. Well, because of a storm, it was preempted, and they weren't able to do it, I don't think, until the next morning or something. But just suddenly a storm blew up on the Galilee, and we were staying right there on that west side. And if we think of the Galilee, it had a nickname in ancient times. It was called Galilee of the Nations, because it was a crossroads for the nations traveling east, west, north, south. They came through the Galilee, and there was quite a bit of foreign influence in the Galilee because of that. Where Yeshua lived, Nazareth, it was only a few kilometers away from Sepphoris, which was a Roman city for all practical purposes. It was like Romanized Jews even. And so it wasn't that far away. You can see how close those who stuck with their faith, stuck with their covenant faith, and then those who were mixing with the nations, with the Greeks and with the Romans and with the Persians and so forth, they would have been living side by side in some cases. So here's where I'm going to see if this will work. Okay.
This beachfront Verbo is about to become part of it.
They're slick, aren't they? What you were seeing there obviously was a storm that blew up on the Sea of Galilee. The reason that I kept turning my phone behind the hotel up toward the mountain was because that's where the storm was coming from. It was coming from the west. I wanted you to see where I dropped the pin where the hotel was on the west side of the lake. And then behind us, coming from the direction of the Mediterranean Sea, coming from the west, you could see what a huge dust storm blew in. That was not a rainstorm. We didn't see rain until, the very end. And plus all that movement that you could sense. I was on the top floor of the hotel, but my windows were tightly shut. So what you were hearing was through closed windows. I was just trying to show the effect it was having on the palm trees and stuff blowing up in the air. And see, I've always kind of been a little skeptical about the disciples being so scared. Once I saw the size of the Sea of Galilee, it was kind of like, oh, seriously, guys, a little storm on this little pond, come on, how bad could it have been? And so that Sukkot, when that storm blew up, I thought, well, how odd. This dust storm blowing in from the west, but look at the effect that it's having on the water. And I could see the smaller boats out there. It was hard for me to zoom in just with a phone, but I could see them trying to get back into the port there in those little boats. And they weren't making much headway. They were really struggling to get back to the port. And I thought, you know what, if they were in one of those first century boats, like we've seen at Novgorod, where they've reconstructed one, I can see why they would have been terrified. If that happened in the night, something like that blew up, okay, yeah, I would be scared too. So I repent of having kind of thought that the disciples weren't really, manning up for the storm on the Sea of Galilee. That got my attention. But then that made me ask the question, why did this happen? Because stuff happens in Israel, and sometimes I know it's something significant, but I don't know why. And then in hindsight, and in this case, a couple of years later, it dawns on me that sometimes he gives you a kiss on the cheek so you'll pay attention. He says, yeah, I'm still around, and my promises are still good. And so as I was putting this together about the four winds, and I saw this thing about Ephraim coming from the west. Like, who are we? What are we doing here? Why are we even bringing tourists here? What does it matter? We could just come on our own and have a big time and rent a van and go where we want to go and do what we want to do. Why do we want to bring tourists? And my answer is, I just love seeing how they when they first see or sense that they're in the land. Sometimes it'll happen in the aircraft. Before you ever land, you'll hear people crying and sniffling. They just hit the airspace and they know they're there. It's worth it just for that. But when they get on the ground and they literally wake up in a new world, not every day, but every 5 minutes, they see something that bears witness to their spirit. And to be able to be there with them and experience that, it's like I get to experience it all over again. It's like truly seeing people come home who have always known where home was, but they've never been allowed to go there. And now here they are. And they don't see it with natural eyes. The ones that do, they tend to stick out in my crowd because they see more than rocks. They see more than sand. They see more than the Sea of Galilee. They see something much deeper calling them home. And so it was like, this is why you're doing it. You're calling them home from the west. I want to show you this storm blowing in from the west so you can see the sand of the seashore blowing into the Galilee of the nations. I want you to see how I'm calling them home. That's why you're bringing tours. And so again, it was like Hebron. It was another kiss on the cheek. It's just, sometimes you just sense that you're doing the right thing, but you can't rationally explain why. Well, he'll come along behind you and says, here's your explanation. You just do it. You do it first. And when I'm ready, I'm going to explain it to you. And so I didn't know why I was taking a picture of a storm, because I really didn't want to be close to those windows. There came a point where the curtains were literally flying out from the force of the wind, and I didn't want to be around the windows. I've always been trained, if there's a tornado coming, you get away from the windows. And it was getting that speed on us. And so I backed away kind of to the inner part of the room. But I think he was making a point with our group and any group like ours that was there. You're coming home. I want to show you how something as scary as this west wind can actually be used for my purpose, to call you back home. So we'll go back to the PowerPoint. Now that we've seen Galilee of the nations in a sandstorm, I'm glad that worked. I hope y'all saw it. So let's go to Yeshua. It says in Mark 4:35, it says, on the same day when evening had come, and that's when this storm hit us. It hit at the evening. They were going to go out with the last of the boats. And of course, like I said, that was canceled because of the storm. But it says on the same day when evening had come, he said to them, let us cross over to the other side. So anytime I see cross over to the other side, I'm thinking way more than just, oh, let's cross the lake. I'm thinking we're about to see something on the spiritual side of things. Now, when they had left the multitude, they took him along in the boat as he was, and other little boats were also with him. And a great windstorm arose. And that's exactly what we just saw. It was a windstorm. It wasn't really a rainstorm. That was dust coming over those mountains. A great windstorm arose, and the waves beat into the boat so that it was already filling. But he was in the stern, asleep on a pillow. And they awoke him and said to him, Teacher, do you not care that we are perishing? Remember, they awoke him. Then he arose and rebuked the wind and said to the sea, Peace, be still. And the wind ceased, and there was great calm. But he said to them, Why are you so fearful? How is it that you have no faith? And they feared exceedingly and said to one another, Who can this be, that even the wind and the sea obey him? And remember, the seas can represent the nations. So Yeshua awakes. There is said to be a particular quality of the north wind. It's said to be the dwelling place of Mashiach. And then we just read the passage that said the north wind was left incomplete. In effect, to give space to the one who would be associated with the Creator himself. I'm not sure how to phrase that. And so Mashiach is in this place of incompleteness. And so that does kind of connect us to what Rabbi Elazar said about the north wind being left incomplete for the person who could come and complete it. It's also thought that Mashiach is going to come from the north. He's going to come from the direction of Edom. And we're going to say in our natural mind, well, Edom's in the south of Israel. But remember, in the four kingdoms, Edom, its capital became Rome. Edom, in Jewish thought, has been Rome for more than 2,000 years. And so Rome is associated with the north. They say that Mashiach will come from the north. Mashiach will come from Edom, just like it says in the prophets. But where we think of him as coming up from the direction of southern Israel, coming up like from the area of Petra and coming up that way, which I think literally he may. I don't ever discount a literal explanation because it needs to be true at the literal level. But there's also a spiritual explanation here. How did the gospel blow around the world? Like it or not, it went through Rome. Once the Constantine came into power, lots of bad things happened, but some good things happened as well. The message of the kingdom was preached to all nations through Edom, through Rome, and through the north wind. And they say that when Mashiach awakes, when Mashiach arises, that he will arise and he will go south to Israel. He will come from Edom and he will build the third temple. And this would be south from the standpoint of the north. If we're looking at Rome, Israel would be in the south. And so last night we talked a little bit about that verse where it's like, awake, O north, and come, O south. And we talked about how these are two different winds and how they don't blow at the same time, or they just cause chaos, but how the Holy One himself can have these two winds blowing simultaneously and there be complete harmony in what they're doing. So here's what it says in the commentary on this. Awake, O north, and come, O south. Awake, O north is an allusion to the Olah offering, which is slaughtered exclusively in the north section of the temple courtyard. Right? So if we think of the Olah offering, it's a lifted up offering. It's like a resurrection offering. It's slaughtered exclusively in the north. Who is our resurrection offering? It's Yeshua. And why is the Olah offering referred to with the term awake? It is because the Olah offering is something that was dormant and was awakened. So, how does Rabbi Elazar interpret this verse? Awake, O north, and come, O south. He says it alludes to three events that will take place in the Messianic era. It alludes to the time when the exiles who were located in the north will awaken, and they will come and encamp in the south. As it states, behold, I will bring them from the land of the north and gather them from the ends of the earth. That's Jeremiah 31:7. It says it alludes to the time when the King Messiah, who is located in the north, will awaken, and he will come and build the holy temple that is located in the south. As it states, I have awakened someone from the north, and he has come, in Isaiah 41:25. So we've got two ideas here, that there are exiles in the north who are going to be awakened, that King Messiah is going to be awakened figuratively from the north, that there will be a type of resurrection. And this is why he would call the south to also blow at the same time as the north. If King Messiah is hidden in the north, if he's been dormant, to use their words, and he needs to be awakened from his dormancy, then calling on the south wind simultaneously, the north wind, give them up, the south wind, don't hold back. By asking the south wind to blow simultaneously, He's asking the dew of resurrection. Remember, dew in the south, dew is always associated with the attribute of resurrection from the dead. So simultaneously, King Messiah, who has been dormant in the north, will awaken, and there will be a great resurrection. So that these two winds that normally don't work together, they will be brought into perfect harmony. So see Yeshua sitting, lying in the boat. He's asleep. He's dormant. Exactly what Rabbi Elazar is saying. Imagine how much sense this would have made to the disciples in hindsight. We get our hindsight aha moments. Imagine the aha moment when they put this together with the prophets and what the prevailing thought was about King Messiah and where he would come from. Yeshua wakes up. They awake him from being dormant. And an awakening, again, is like resurrection. When you awake from the dead, awake you sleeper, arise from the dead. So it's like there's two forces that come together. You have this rousing from dormancy, and then you have this resurrection. And so if the thought was King Mashiach is dormant in the north, and when Mashiach comes, he is going to complete the north wind. He's going to complete the work assigned to the north wind. That helps us understand that strange statement that Rabbi Elazar made earlier in the quote that I showed you earlier, that Mashiach is going to come from the north. He's going to build the third temple in the south. And that's how these two winds are working together. Let's see. The words awake, O north encompasses three distinct calls for someone from the north to end his long time inactivity, and it beckons him, come south. The verse simultaneously calls upon the exiles to be stirred from their interminable displacement. In other words, we've been dormant with Messiah in the north. If you just want to, not sidestep the issue, it's saying what's going to happen is there's going to be exiles who will be stirred from Christianity, because Rome and Edom are thought to be Christianity today. Thus, they didn't see the Christianity part in the first century, but they definitely saw the Rome part. And so the fourth kingdom, that they would rise and they would come out of that fourth kingdom of Rome. And we know that the Roman Church was just a continuation of the Roman Empire. It says they will be stirred from their displacement and take up residence in the land of Israel. It will also call upon Gog to actuate his march toward the land of Israel, and upon Messiah to at last initiate his long-awaited reconstruction of the temple. So it's saying the call going out is to awaken the exiles to come back to the land, awaken them from the nations. Where does this incident take place? It takes place in Galilee of the nations. And we've got two prophecies that work together here. We have Ephraim coming from the west, and then we have exiles also coming from the north, which they say would be primarily Jews. But there's also Ephraim coming in. And so the blowing of these winds, it says, at the same time, is to gather in the exiles. And with these words, God will command the winds to return the exiles to the land of Israel. Since the exiles will be arriving by sea. Remember, this happens on the Sea of Galilee. I always wonder why they call it a sea. Now we know, because it's a little microcosm of the exiles coming over the seas. It says they will be arriving by sea from opposite directions. Both northerly and southerly winds will be required simultaneously. Remember, the south is associated with the dew, the resurrection. Furthermore, the fact that God will need to instruct the southern wind not to withhold while the north wind blows indicates that typically one direction does withhold its wind while the other blows. Okay, so basically it's saying it's going to take King Messiah to arouse in the north and to cause two things that normally don't go together to actually begin working together. For there to be an awakening of the dormancy of the exiles, and for there be a resurrection symbolized by the dew that the south wind brings. Now the little boat trip makes way more sense, because if he's King Messiah, he will be awakened from his dormancy, and he will be able to synthesize the winds. They will obey his authority. He will tell them to behave in a way that is peaceful, that rather than causing chaos, because they normally don't go together, he can call these both of the winds, their power, and actually harmonize them. And he's saying, you don't have faith. You don't have faith. Because there's something in this incident that was supposed to make the 12 disciples have faith. And he's like, who is this? Even the wind and the sea obey him. Well, again, we've just read the context of the wind and the sea obeying the one who will be like God. Now, let's see where Yeshua might have had remember, the roots of prophecy are in the Torah. So let's find the root of this prophecy in the Torah. It's in Genesis 28:10 through 16. And this is Jacob on the run from Esau. And that's the question. Why did this incident happen on the Sea of Galilee? And why do we need to know that Yeshua slept on a pillow specifically? They could have just said he was asleep in the boat. Why do we need to know he was on a pillow or a bed? Depends on your translation. So let's look at Jacob's departure. It says, Jacob departed from Beersheba and went toward Haran. And he happened upon a particular place and spent the night there, because the sun had set. That's exactly what happened on the Sea of Galilee. The sun had set when the storm blew up. And he took one of the stones of the place and made it a support for his head and lay down in that place. He made it into a pillow. And he had a dream, and behold, a ladder was set up on the earth with its top reaching to heaven. And behold, the angels of God were ascending and descending on it. Were these the same angels that hold back the four winds or make the four winds blow? We don't know. Then behold, the Lord was standing above it and said, I am the Lord, the God of your father Abraham and the God of Isaac. The land on which you lie, I will give to you and to your descendants. Now just remember the video. Remember that dust blowing over the mountains from the west. Your descendants will also be like the dust of the earth, and you will spread out to the west and to the east and to the north and to the south. And in you and in your descendants shall all the families of the earth be blessed. Well, last night's message was, if you're obedient to the Torah, this is how he releases blessing on the earth. And so, in spite of the fact they're going to be spread out and scattered to the east, west, the north, and the south, they can still obey the Torah and still bring blessing on the earth wherever they are. And through this, all the families of the earth are going to be blessed. Behold, I am with you and will keep you wherever you go, and will bring you back to this land. For I will not leave you until I have done what I have promised you. Then Jacob awoke from his sleep and said, the Lord is certainly in this place, and I did not know it. So Jacob awoke. What are we supposed to see here? Well, we're told in verse 18 Jacob got up early in the morning and took the stone that he had placed as a support for his head and set it up as a memorial stone and poured oil on its top. He anointed it with oil. Mashiach. Well, what is Messiah? Mashiach, the anointed one. And so I put the Hebrew text in here so you could read it, and you'll see twice the word Rosh. Rosh. So the support for his head, the root word in it is Rosh, right? It's a construct. Meroshtav. So the support for his head. And then he said he poured oil on its top. Top is Rosha. Rosha. So twice there. The pillow is actually a support for his head. And then the top of the stone that was anointed with oil was also the Rosha, its top, or her top. And so the porters of, when you talk about a pillow, what's the root word? Rosh, head. It's where your head goes. And so back on the galley, it says when Yeshua was in the hinder part of the ship, asleep on a pillow, which is Strong's G 4344, and they awake him and say unto him, Master, do you not care that we perish? And so Messiah is being awakened here, and he's asleep on a pillow. So this pillow, 4344 in the Greek, if you look that up, it says it's a compound of 4314 and 2776. So I tossed out the preposition, 4314, and I went to the root word, which is 2776, looked it up. And what I looked for was the cognate to that Greek word for pillow. And the Hebrew cognate, Rosh, the head. So we've got a connection here between Jacob's fleeing and going to the land of Lavan, where he's about to produce some fruit, and Yeshua sleeping in the boat with his head on the pillow. And the promise that even though Jacob's descendants, his fruit, would spread out north, south, east, and west, nevertheless, they would bless all the families of the earth, wherever they were. And they're going to return in peace because, remember, King Messiah can manage these winds. So what would be destructive to the rest of the world would actually be winds that would carry these exiles back to the place of the pillow. That's what Jacob, I'll bring them right back here to your pillow. Jacob, your anointed pillow. I'll bring you back to the place of Mashiach. And if you read the Midrash to the Song of Songs 117, and we read that last week, where it talks about the beams and the paneling of cedar and cypress in the house, the Midrash says that the stone pillow that Jacob slept on, it says it became like a bed filled with feathers beneath him, which refers to what it says in the Song of Songs, our bed is full of vigor. This is taken to mean that Jacob's soft stone, his feather pillow or his feather pillow bed, would begin to produce fruits, the 12 tribes. And then there was an odd little thing thrown in there. In that Midrash, it says the feathers from this soft pillow bed became cedar and cypress, as described in the song that we read last week. The beams of our houses are cedars, our panels, cypresses. So Jacob is, at that point, is heading north across Lebanon, which is known for its cypresses and cedars. He would be fathering 13 children to bring home to the place of the pillow. to the place where the little feather nest is, to the place of the anointing, to the place of Mashiach. And the Midrash says that these cypresses and cedars are the righteous men and women, the prophets and prophetesses who arose from Jacob. And therefore, they're described as the cedars and the cypresses of the house, of the temple, functioning as the equivalent, going back to our Torah portion, of their desert cousin in the Mishkan, the humble acacia. They're from the same family of trees. So you've got this little humble acacia out in the wilderness, and then you have these majestic cedars and cypresses that were used for the bones of the temple. So obedience could bring peace to the four winds. Rebellion would bring bewilderment in the wilderness and chaos. And so that's our job, to remember, again, 4 is 7 and 7 is 4, and the realm of the spirit. And you can see this in the menorah. There's 7 branches on the menorah, but they're one piece of beaten gold. So in a sense, they're only one. But if you look at the center, that's the original pillar from which the 6 branches were hammered out. So that middle pillar is actually the fullness of the 7. The 7 is the completion of the 4. The 4 is the fullness of all 7. And so it's the axis. It's the axis of everything, and it has to do with spiritual authority. If you've done Workbook 1, you know we're talking about spiritual authority when we talk about 4. And so we have 4 winds. When we talk about 4 winds, we're talking about spiritual authority, the spirit of Adonai. So it says the 12 tribes who had their own banners camped in 4 divisions. Each divisional degel or banner, it had that graphic of the 4 living creatures, the lion, the man, the bull, and the eagle. There's also the 4 angels at each direction who will hold back the winds. And they may be both natural and spiritual, because remember, wind in Hebrew is ruach, which is also spirit. And based on the book of Daniel, the sages believe that these 4 angels are responsible for the 4 kingdoms. So in essence, as these 12 tribes camped and journeyed, their job was, in this census, to be counted as an army. Their job was to watch over the camp and to watch over the Mishkan. Remember, it's Adonai's vineyard. When the vineyard begins to decline spiritually, then that leads to the rise of the 4 kingdoms. And that's why these banners were so important. They represented that spiritual obligation of the tribes of Israel. Not just for the protection of their own camps, but eventually becoming part of the prophecy of how those exiles would be brought back from the 4 winds. They would be returned to their land. So that takes us back to the first verse there of our Torah portion, where it talks about, how Adonai spoke to Moses in the wilderness of Sinai. And it says God spoke to Moses in the Sinai wilderness. Anyone who does not make themselves ownerless, like the wilderness, cannot acquire the wisdom and the Torah. Therefore, it says the Sinai wilderness. And that's a picture there that I took out in the wilderness, down in the Arava, and a big dust storm blew up while we were down there. I think Keisha was with me that day. And it was pretty big, but it was interesting to watch it because it was so far in the distance to watch how it was moving. But you can see out there in that desert, in that wilderness, there's nothing. And that's what we have to make ourselves. He takes us in the wilderness so we will make ourselves nothing. And where I want to go with this on Shabbat is to show us what the desert says, what the wilderness says, because what the wilderness says applies to the human beings. It's extending this idea of King Mashiach speaking to those winds to bring the exiles home, to defeat Gog and Magog, to rebuild, or not rebuild, but to build the third temple. You're not rebuilding anything. It's going to be a temple of perfection. And in order to inherit that, first, you have to have this Mishkan type existence. You have to be raised up in the wilderness where you are. And so it takes a certain humility out there in the wilderness before you truly get the majesty and the glory of becoming those cedars and beams of the temple itself under the kingdom of King Mashiach. And I guess that would be a good stopping place for now. Just in interest of time, don't want to take it too far because we can finish it up next week. But I did want you to get an idea of the spiritual authority that is represented by these four winds, so that when you start seeing these fours that go with the sevens in Revelation, like when you see the four horses, that's not accidental that they're in the context of the seven seals, the seven spirits, the seven assemblies, and so forth. You're really talking about the same thing. And the idea that King Mashiach would be standing there, having been aroused from his dormancy and roaring like a lion. He's appearing there, like you said, he's going to hear a lion roaring. King Messiah is going to rouse himself from the tribe of Judah, and he's going to roar. And the other tribes, remember, Judah always took the lead in the movement. Once they saw the movement of the cloud and the ark, Judah would be the first tribe to set out. And so the tribe of Judah is rousing. King Messiah is rousing. The Lion of Judah is rousing from his dormancy. And when he begins roaring, we're going to move. It's going to be moving day. And so right now it's our job to humble ourselves in the wilderness and to prepare ourselves to cross over.